Welcome back to Next Sleep Stories. Before we begin tonight, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave it quietly in the comments below. Now, set aside whatever the day has brought you. Let your shoulders soften. Close your eyes. You've earned this rest. Take a slow, gentle breath. Let my voice carry you somewhere peaceful, somewhere still. A world of warm fireplaces, quiet evenings, and stories told in unhurried time. We begin now. Sleep is on its way. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Elena Marsh had always considered the most unremarkable day of the week. And perhaps that was fitting, because at first she had read it twice without truly understanding what it meant. Her aunt's solicitor and Mr. Graves of Harriet had written in Clear's, a careful, unhurried hand, and the words were simple enough. Miss Ruth Marsh had passed peacefully in her sleep on the 14th of October, and she had left her entire estate, comprising one stone cottage and one tea shop at number 4 Thornwick Lane, Thornwick Village, Yorkshire, to her granddaughter, Elena Marsh, formerly of Camden, London. Formerly of Camden. Elena had smiled faintly at that. She supposed she was formerly of Camden. She was formerly of a great many things. Now, 3 weeks later, she sat in the second carriage of the northbound train, her face turned toward the window, watching England change around her. London had given way to Hertfordshire, then to the rolling open country of the Midlands. And now, as the afternoon stretched long and amber across the land, Yorkshire was beginning, really beginning, in the way it only could if you had never seen it before. The hills arrived gradually, as if they did not want to startle anyone. First a gentle swelling of the fields, then stone walls appearing where there had been hedge, then the valleys deepening on either side of the track, and the light doing something altogether different from what it did in the city. It pulled, it gathered in the low places and glowed there, warm and unhurried, as if time itself moved more slowly in this part of the world. Eleanor had 2 bags. One held her clothes, her notebooks, 3 novels she had packed with the best of intentions, and the small tin of shortbread she had bought to King's Cross, without entirely knowing why. The other held something more complicated, the letter from Mr. Graves, a photograph of Ruth, taken sometime in the 1860s, young, bright-eyed, standing in front of a shop door, with her arms folded, and a look of cheerful stubbornness about her, and a small envelope that Mr. Graves had included with a note saying only, "She asked me to give you this when the time came." She was quite specific about the timing. Elena had not opened the small envelope yet. She had held it on several evenings, turning it over in her hands, feeling the slight weight of whatever was inside. Paper, she thought, folded several times, and each time she had placed it back in the bag and made herself a cup of tea instead. She was not ready. She would know when she was ready, and the moment had not yet arrived. Outside the window, a village passed, just a glimpse of Greystone, a church spire, smoke rising straight and slow from a cluster of chimneys. And then the fields returned, and a river appeared below the embankment, silver and unhurried, winding through the valley floor, as if it had never been told there was anywhere it needed to be. Elena pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. Somewhere ahead, a place she had never been, was waiting for her. A shop full of tea, a life she had not chosen and had not expected. She was 52 years old, and she had the peculiar sensation, not unpleasant, of being at the very beginning of something. The train did not hurry. The hills did not move aside. The light continued to pull in the valleys, golden and patient. She would arrive when she arrived. The station at Thornwick was so small that Elena almost missed it entirely. There was no announcement, no porter appearing at the carriage door, and the platform, if it could properly be called that, was nothing more than a raised strip of stone, barely long enough to accommodate 2 carriages. A painted sign on a post read, "Thornwick," in letters that had once been black and were now the grey of old weather. A single gas lamp stood unlit in the last of the afternoon light. A bench held no one. Elena stepped down with her 2 bags and stood for a moment, breathing in the air, which was nothing like London air. It was cold, and very clean, and carried the smell of cut grass, and something faintly mineral stone, perhaps, or the particular damp of mand, and underneath all of it, so faint she might have imagined it, the sweetness of something dried and herbal. She breathed in again. It was still there. She was the only person to have alighted from the train. The engine gathered itself with a long exhalation of steam, and moved on without ceremony. And within 30 seconds, she could no longer hear it. And the silence that replaced it was extraordinary. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a place that was thoroughly contentedly itself. Wind moved through the long grass on the far side of the track. Somewhere a sheep called once, and was answered. The gas lamp gave a soft click, and came to life. Amber and warm, casting a small circle of lights around the bench, and the sign, and Elelaninas. 2 bags which stood at her feet, like faithful dogs. There was no one to meet her. She had not expected anyone. Mr. Graves had sent a map, hand-drawn on good paper, with the route from the station to the village, marked in blue ink. She unfolded it now, and studied it in the lamplight. The village was a quarter-mile walk, along a lane that ran east from the station, through a field, gate, past a farm and its outbuildings, and then into Thornwick Lane itself, which curved gently around to the village green, a quarter-mile. She picked up her bags and set off. The lane was narrower than she had expected, bounded on both sides by dry stone walls of the particular Yorkshire kind, dark, mossy, fitted together without mortar, as solid as the land itself. The evening sky above her was a deep and luminous, clears, blue, the last colour draining slowly from the west, and the first stars were appearing with a tentative quality of things not yet certain. Clears. They were welcome. Bats crossed the lane in swift, erratic arcs. The grass at the wall tops moved in the breeze with a sound like breathing. Elelena walked slowly. She was not a woman who rushed. She had learned in the years since her husband died, and her teaching post had ended, and the world had reduced itself to the width of a Camden flat, that slow and deliberate attention was the nearest thing to peace she had found. One thing at a time, one step at a time. Here, the smell of the lane. Here, the bats. Here, the warm yellow lights appearing ahead as the lane curved. The first cottages of Thornwick coming into view, stone and solid and lit from within. Clears. Throat she paused at the field gate and looked. It was, she thought, the most quietly beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. She did not move for a full minute. She simply looked. Thornwick at dusk was a place that seemed entirely unaware of the rest of the world's opinion of itself, which was probably, Elelena thought, exactly what gave it its particular character. The village green was not large, perhaps 30 paces across, and the chestnut tree at its centre was old enough to have witnessed several generations of everything. Its roots had long since lifted the paving stones around it into a gentle upheaval that nobody had thought to repair, not because they lacked the means, but because the paving stones in their lifted, imperfect state seemed natural, and the trees seemed to prefer it that way. Around the green stood perhaps a dozen buildings, a public house with a swinging sign, the Shepherd's Rest, from which came the low murmur of voices, and the smell of coal smoke, and something being cooked with rosemary. A small post office shuttered now, a church of Norman foundation, with a yew, in the churchyard so dark it was nearly invisible against the night sky. A bakery, identifiable by the ghost of bread, still warm in the air outside it. And on the far side of the green, just where Mr. Graves's map had promised, a narrow building of the same grey Yorkshire stone as everything else, with a single bow window that glowed with a light so warm and amber it looked from across the green like a small, domesticated version of the setting sun. Number 4, Thornwick Lane, the Marsh Tea Shop. Elelena stood at the edge of the green and looked at it for a long time. She was aware of being looked at in return, though not directly. A curtain moved in the cottage adjacent, and a man coming out of the Shepherd's Rest paused on the step and watched her for a moment before disappearing back inside. Small villages noticed strangers. That was simply the nature of them. The shop window held a display she could see even from across the green, a collection of small glass jars arranged on a deep windowsill, each one catching the interior light and turning it different colors: amber, pale gold, deep brown, the greenish tint of dried mint. Between the jars, someone, Ruth, she supposed on her last day of arranging things, had placed a fall card on which was written in handwriting. Elena recognized instantly from 30 years of birthday letters the words, "Welcome. Whatever brought you here." Elena felt the breath go out of her. She stood very still on the edge of the green, in the cooling evening air, with a chestnut tree behind her and the lamplight of the village in front of her, and she felt something loosen in her creased that she had not known was tight. She crossed the green slowly, her bags bumping against her knees. She found the key in the envelope Mr. Graves had sent, large and iron and slightly rusty at the bow, and she put it in the lock of the dark green door. And she turned it, and the door opened with a long, unhurried groan of a door that has been still for a little while, but is not in the least unwilling to move again. She stepped inside. The smell reached her before her eyes had adjusted to the light. It was not a single smell that would have been too simple, too easy to name and set aside. It was a conversation between many things: lavender, certainly, and the dry warmth of salon tea, and something spiced that might have been cardamom or clove, and beneath all of that, a deeper note like old wood and beeswax, and the pages of books that have been read many times. Elena stood just inside the closed door, with her bags at her feet, and breathed in again, and felt the particular quality of the air settle around her, like something put on after a long time away. The interior of the Marsh tea shop was narrow and tall ceiling, lit by 2 oil lamps, whose light fell warm and amber across everything. The left wall was almost entirely shelving, deep wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, painted in a dark green that had faded to the color of old sage, and on every shelf, jars, hundreds of them, of every size, all glass, all sealed with cork or tin lids, all labeled in Roos's handwriting. Elena moved toward them, shelves slowly, as though approaching something sleeping. The labels were, she saw immediately, not what she had expected. She had imagined something practical: English breakfast, Darjeeling, Earl Grey. But what she found instead was this: "The morning after snow," written in small, careful letters, and beside it, "When you cannot sleep," and beside that, for a letter difficult to write, and the garden in September, and your mother's kitchen, and the last day of the holidays, and what patience feels like. Elena stood before the shelves with her hand raised but not quite touching, moving along the rows, reading A Quiet Sunday, the feeling of arriving home before a long journey for a friend you have not seen in years, the smell of books in an old house, first frost, steady rain on a tin roof. Everything will be all right. She stopped at that one. Everything will be all right. The jar was medium-sized, filled with a mixture that was deep and complex. She could see dried flowers, and what appeared to be dried apple peel, and something darker, like roasted grain. The label was slightly faded, as if it had been made earlier than the others. She picked it up carefully, and held it in both hands, feeling the smooth weight of the glass, the faint coolness of it against her palms. From the far corner, a small clock on the mantelpiece above the fireplace ticked softly. The fireplace itself held a grate that was cold, but laid ready with paper and kindling and 2 pieces of coal. Someone, Mr. Graves perhaps, or a neighbor he had engaged, had thought of this. Elena found the matches on the mantelpiece shelf, knelt and lit the fire. She sat on the low wooden bench beside the fireplace and held the jar in her lap while the kindling, cord and the coal began to glow and the room grew gradually warm. Elena slept that first night in the small bedroom above the shop, in a bed that had clearly been Ruth's. Its iron frame painted white, its pillows smelling of dried lavender, its quilt a patchwork of many different fabrics in many different browns and greens, and the occasional defiant patch of deep red. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, which had a crack in the plaster shaped if she tilted, her head a little like the Yorkshire coast, and she listened to the village settle into its night. There was rain eventually. It came quietly, beginning with just the sound of individual drops on the windowsill, and then filling in gradually until it was a steady, even sound against the glass. The kind of rain that has no urgency in it, that is simply present. The wind moved in the elm tree that stood behind the cottage. She had noticed it in the dusk, old and wide, its remaining leaves the color of tarnished gold, and the sound of the wind in its branches was a long, slow sighing that rose and fell like breathing. She thought about Ruth, not with grief, exactly, or not only with grief, but with the particular quality of wondering that comes when a person you loved is gone, and you find yourself surrounded by the life they built. Every object in this room had been chosen by Ruth, had been touched by Ruth's hands, had been useful, or beautiful, or necessary to Ruth's daily existence. The small blue jug on the windowsill, the stack of books on the bedside table. She had looked at the spines before getting into bed. 2 novels she recognized, one on the history of Chinese tea cultivation, one slim volume of poetry by a woman she had not heard of, a pair of reading glasses folded on top of the poetry, as if Ruth had simply put them down and stepped out. Elena reached out and touched the reading glasses very lightly with one finger. The rain continued. The wind moved in the elm tree. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked twice, and then thought better of it. Elena turned on her side, pulling the patchwork quilt closer, and felt the warmth of the bed settle around her. She had not opened the small envelope yet. She had not opened it, and she was not yet ready. And that was perfectly fine. Some things needed to arrive in their own time, like the rain, like the warmth of a fire, like the understanding that sometimes the right thing to do was simply to be present in a place and allow the place to make itself known. She closed her eyes. The rain spoke softly to the window. The elm tree breathed. She slept. She woke before 6 and lay still for several minutes, listening to determine where she was, which was something she had done every morning since James died. That brief floating interval between sleep and waking, when the world had not yet declared itself. Then the patchwork quilt made itself known, and the sound of a wood pigeon in the elm tree, and the particular quality of the light coming through the curtains, which was the cool, diffuse light of an English October morning, and she knew Thornwick, the tea shop, hers, apparently now. She dressed warmly, wool, stockings, her good green dress, a knitted shawl she had not taken off since Leeds, and went downstairs and found, to her great satisfaction, that the kitchen at the back of the shop was both well supplied and well arranged. Ruth had always been organized in the particular way of people who consider disorganization a kind of rudeness to the future self. The kettle was on the hook above the range. The range itself was cold, but required only a handful of the small coals from the scuttle beside it, bread, and a pot of jam. Damson, unlabeled homemade, sat on the kitchen table, with a note beneath a jam in handwriting she did not recognize from Ada Pendleton next door but one. "Welcome to Thornwick. Come over when you like." Elena smiled. She lit the range. She put the kettle on. While she waited, she opened the back door. The back garden was small and south-facing, enclosed by the same dry stone walls as the lane, and it was. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Wonderful. Not because it was tidy, because it was not. It was the opposite of tidy. It was a garden that had been deeply loved and allowed to follow its own inclinations to a significant degree. Raised beds ran along both sides, planted with what she recognized as dried lavender, chamomile, mint, several varieties she thought, given the different leaf shapes, lemon balm and several things she could not immediately name. Bundles of dried herbs hung from a wooden frame along the south wall. A cold frame covered what appeared to be seedlings with a patience that would carry them through winter, and in the center of it all, a single wooden chair, weathered gray, positioned to catch the most sun, with a cushion so faded she could no longer tell what color it had originally been. Elalana stepped out in her shawl and stood in the October air, which was sharp and cold, and smelled of the garden. She turned her face up. The sky was very pale blue, and a thin mist was lifting off the hills above the village, and the morning was very quiet. The kettle began to sing distantly in the kitchen. She went in, made the tea, plain since she had not yet learned the names of what filled all those jars, and brought it back to the garden, and sat in Ruth's chair, and drank it slowly, watching the mist dissolve. Ada Pendleton arrived at 8, with the unstoppable quality of someone who has decided to be helpful, and has determined that the best time for helpfulness is immediately. She was a compact, energetic woman of about 44, with auburn hair that had escaped his pins in at least 3 places, and a red postal coat that she wore with a conviction of someone for whom it was less a uniform, and more a statement of character. She came around the back gate rather than the front door, which told Elalana several things about her without a word being said. "You found the jam," she said, coming to a stop in the garden doorway and looking at the pot on the kitchen table with the satisfaction of a woman whose gifts have been appreciated. "Good. I wasn't sure if you'd arrived last night or this morning. Thomas Hale saw the light in the shop around 9 o'clock and came and told me, and I thought I'd bick and leave it until morning." "Was the bed all right?" "The bed was perfectly all right," Elalana said. "And the range?" "I managed it," nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Ruth said, "You were practical. Sit down. Let me make a fresh pot. You've been up since before dawn. I can tell your cup is stone cold. Where do you want to start? There's the shop to open eventually, though you don't have to do that today, or this week. There's Mr. Graves's paperwork. There's meeting people. The village will want to meet you. They're very interested. You're the first person Ruth mentioned to anyone in 20 years. She talked about you, you know, said you were the one she worried about." Elalana blinked. "She worried about me, in Clear's throat's the best way." Ada had already filled the kettle and put it on the range, and was now moving through the kitchen, with a confident navigation of someone who'd been in this room many times. She opened a cupboard and found the good tea tray without hesitation. "In the way you worry about someone with too much sense and not enough permission to use it." Her words, not mine. "I'm just the messenger." She glanced over her shoulder with a quick, bright smile. "Literally. In fact, I am the postwoman." Eleanor found herself laughing. A real laugh, not the polite approximation she had offered to most people for the past several years. It surprised her. She sat down at the kitchen table, and Ada sat opposite her, and the kettle came quickly to the boil, and the second cup of tea of the morning was made, and outside the garden held its October stillness, and inside something began quietly to change. After Ada left reluctantly, as she was due at the post office by 9, but with a firm promise of returning that afternoon, Elalana sat alone at the kitchen table with a third cup of tea and Ruth's notebook, which she had found the previous evening in the drawer of the small desk in the shop's back corner, and which she had been carrying with her unopened in the pocket of her shawl since this morning. It was a brown leather notebook, well worn, its cover soft from years of handling, its corners slightly curled. The clasp was a simple one, a leather loop over a bone button, and Elalana unfastened it and opened the cover. Inside, in Ruth's handwriting, a handwriting she had loved since childhood, large and slanted and full of confidence. The occasional, entirely unnecessary flourish on capital letters was written for Elalana, who I have been waiting to meet properly for a very long time. These are not recipes. Not exactly. They are conversations I began with this village, and with the people in it, over 40 years. You'll find if you pay attention, that each blend knows what is for better than I do. I just mix the ingredients. The intention was already there in the leaves. The rules are simple. Mix nothing in anger. Measure nothing in haste. Taste everything before you offer it to anyone. And if someone doesn't want what you've made, don't insist. Start with the garden after rain. It is the most forgiving blend I know. Elena turned the pages slowly. The notebook was full, every page covered in Rue's handwriting, the recipes interspersed with observations with small watercolor sketches of herbs and flowers with notes about customers. Thomas Hale takes his tea very strong. No milk, no sugar, but ask him if he'd like a piece of the shortbread, and he'll always say yes, though he pretends to think about it. And the children from the school come on Fridays. Make extra of the apple and cinnamon. It's the one that says safe to them. I think the smell of it through the door is enough. And Reverend Birch has been coming every Tuesday for 31 years. He never asks for anything specific, just sits. Give him whatever feels right. He's had every blend I've made, and never once said the wrong thing about any of them. Elena sat with the notebook open across her knees, and the tea cooling in her cup, and the morning light moving slowly across the kitchen floor. 40 years. 40 years. Her grandmother had sat in this kitchen, had walked out to that garden, had stood behind that counter, and learned the names and the longings and the quiet needs of this entire village. She turned to the first recipe page, the garden after rain. The ingredients were listed, in Ruth's careful hand with notes beside each one. She read slowly, learning the language of it. She thought she might open the shop on Thursday. She met Thomas Hale for the first time on Wednesday afternoon, which was the day she spent cleaning the shop properly, taking down every jar from every shelf, dusting each one, checking the seals, replacing the few that had lost their cork stoppers, and placing them all back in order. She had been at it since 9 in the morning, and by 2 o'clock she had completed 2.5 of the 4 walls, and developed a comprehensive, if entirely unsolicited, knowledge of her grandmother's entire range of tea blends. She was on a small step-ladder, reaching for a jar on the top shelf. Midsummer morning, it said, and something inside it was green and bright-smelling, something that cut through the general warmth of the room with a clarity like cold water. When she heard the shop bell, which she had not yet opened the door of, ring once, she turned, holding the jar, and there was a man in the doorway. He was very tall and very broad, and wore a flat cap and a brown wool coat that had seen considerable use, and none of it gentle. His face was weathered, in the way of faces that have spent decades looking into the wind and finding it no hardship. He had a grey beard, neatly kept, and dark eyes that moved around the shop with the careful quality of someone noting what had changed and what had not. Door was unlocked, he said, by way of explanation. He had a Yorkshire accent that Elena had expected, and a voice that was lower and quieter than she had expected. I've been airing the place, she said. Elena Marsh. She came down from the stepladder and held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His hand was very large and very calloused, and the handshake was brief and firm. Thomas Hale Farm, far end of the lane. I know, Ada told me. The farm, with the good stone walls. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. She said, you build better walls than anyone in the Dale. He looked away at the shelves. His gaze moved along them with a different quality now, slower, more careful. Elena let the silence sit, because it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of someone deciding something. She always made me something, he said at last, still looking at the shelves. Miss Ruth, when I came in after the hard days, something to take home. He turned and looked at Elena directly. She ever tell you which one? Not specifically, but I'm learning the notebook. Elena looked at the shelves herself. After a moment, she stepped forward and reached for a jar near the middle of the third shelf. 2 chairs by the fire, said the label in Ruth's hand. She held it out to him. This one, I think. He looked at the label for a long time, and he took the jar from her hands. He said, that's the one. That evening, when the shop was tidied, and the last jar was back in its place, and the late October dusk was settling over the village, Elena sat at the small table by the window and made herself a proper cup from the shop for the first time. She had chosen the garden after rain, as Ruth had instructed. She had read the recipe 3 times. The blend was built on a base of green tea from Darjeeling, light with a faintly grassy quality of first flush leaves, to which Ruth had added dried chamomile flowers, a small quantity of dried rose petals from the back garden. The note in the margin specified only from the old rose, the dark pink one, against the east wall. A pinch of dried lemon verbena, and what the recipe described simply as a small quantity of the wet earth from clears beneath the herb beds, dried and powdered fine. Eleanor had stared at that last ingredient for some time before deciding to trust it. She brought the water to just below the boil, as Ruth specified. She measured the blend into Ruth's brown teapot. 3 heaped teaspoons for 1 cup, which seemed generous, but the note said, "This blend does not benefit from economy." She poured the water. She placed the lid on the pot. She set the small sand timer that lived on the shelf above the kitchen range. 4 minutes. No more, no less. She sat down and watched the timer. The shop was very quiet. Outside the window, the village green was empty in the dusk. The chestnut tree standing in its lamplight, a light rain beginning to mist the glass. Inside, the oil lamp on the table cast a steady warm light, and the smell of the steeping tea rose around her, green and floral, and underneath it, something deeper, something that was not quite any single ingredient, but was all of them together, and something else beside. She thought of gardens. She thought of the particular silence after rain, when the world is clean and new and very still. The sand ran out. She poured. The cup was pale gold. She wrapped her hands around it and felt the warmth travel through her palms, and she brought it to her lips and drank slowly, not tasting so much as receiving. The way you receive a piece of music that you have never heard before, but that seems to contain something you have always known. She sat for a long time after the cup was empty, her hands still wrapped around the warm ceramic, looking out at the rainy dark. She felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, entirely at rest. Elena had slept well again, which was its own kind of wonder. She had been a poor sleeper for years, lying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, doing the quiet circular mathematics of worry. But here, in the room above the shop, with the elm tree and the October rain and the patchwork quilt, sleep came like a tide and took her completely. She woke at 6 o'clock, both mornings, feeling, if not exactly rested, in the way of the young, then rested in a more valuable way, the way of someone who has been set down gently and allowed to be still. Thursday arrived bright and cold, with a frost that had whitened the rooftops and the tops of the stone walls and the grass on the village green, and made everything look as though it had been drawn in detail with a very fine pen. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window while the range heated the kettle and looked at it all. The white rooftops, the pale sky, the clear, sharp line of the hills above the village, and felt something that it took her a moment to identify because it had been so long. Anticipation. She had anticipated nothing for a very long time. She had moved through days that were adequately filled and largely painless. But anticipation was a different thing. It required a future that held something worth moving toward, and she had not until this week had a clear sense of what that might be. She unlocked the front door of the shop at 9 o'clock precisely, turned the small wooden sign from closed to open, a sign she had noticed, had not said anything else in the 14 years since Ruth had made it, and stepped back behind the counter. At 5 minutes past 9, Ada came in just to see, she said, which both of them knew was not entirely true. At 29, 2 women who introduced themselves as Mrs. Fowler and her daughter came in. Mrs. Fowler was perhaps 70, small and clear as throat, upright, with a kind of grey hair that had once been black and still carried something of its original force. She looked at Elena with a careful measuring quality of someone assessing whether the new person is going to be adequate. And then she looked at the shelves, and something in her expression softened. She kept it just the same, she said, very quietly, not to Elena, but to the shelves. She bought a jar of Sunday morning no rush, and a small packet of what Ruth had called a plain good ezim, for when you don't need anything in particular. By 11, 7 more people had come in. By lunchtime, Elena had sold 12 jars of tea, 3 packets of the plain blends, had made 4 cups for customers, who sat at the 2 tables by the window, and had spoken to enough people to know that Thornwick was the kind of village where everyone knew everything about everyone, and found this entirely natural. She had also been told twice that she looked like Ruth around the eyes, which she found was the nicest thing anyone had said to her in years. Reverend Callum Birch came in on the following Tuesday, as Ada had told her he always would at 2, which was after his afternoon visiting and before his evening prayers, and which represented, as far as Elena could tell from the evidence in Ruth's notebook, the best part of 30 years of unbroken Tuesday afternoon tea. He was a tall man, still, though slightly stooped now, 77, Ada, Clears, had said, though he carried it without apparent concern, with white hair and Clears' deep-set eyes of a grey-blue colour, and a careful, unhurried way of moving through the world that Elena recognized as the movement of someone who has decided, consciously or not, that rushing is a form of inattention. He wore his black coat and his clerical collar, and carried a walking cane he clearly did not particularly need, the way some people carry umbrellas, not against the rain, but as a way of being comfortable in their hands. He sat at the corner table, the table furthest from the window and nearest the fireplace, and he set his hat on the chair beside him, and he folded his hands on the table, and he looked at Elena with the attentive, non-intrusive quality of someone who is waiting without pressure. Elena brought him a cup. She had spent some time that morning considering what Ruth had meant by "give him whatever feels right," and had eventually decided that this was not instructions about intuition so much as about attention, that if you paid proper attention to a person, you would know what they needed without their having to tell you. So she had stood in front of the shelves for a full 3 minutes, looking at the jars, and she had come away with a quiet Sunday. He held the cup with both hands as she did, and breathed in the steam for a moment before drinking. Then he said, "You're Ruth, not a question. Her granddaughter." He nodded slowly. "She talked about you, not often, but with a great deal of care." He looked into his cup. "She said you had the quality of a person who listens well." She considered that a rarer gift than most people recognize. He looked up and met her eyes. She was right. Elena had nothing to say to this, and so said nothing which she had learned was in many cases the correct response. He drank his tea. She sat across the table from him. The fire settled. The village moved on outside in its quiet afternoon way. They did not speak again for quite some time, and it was entirely pleasant. On Friday evening, when the shop was closed and the village had grown quiet and the last light was fading from the hills above Thornwick, Elena sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's notebook and a cup of tea. She was working her way through the blend systematically, one new one each evening, which felt like the right pace, and read. She had reached the section of the notebook that Ruth had titled in her large handwriting, "Notes Clears Throat, on what people really ask for," which was different, Ruth had written in the introduction, from what they say they want. What they say, "I'll have whatever is nice." What they mean, "I need something that doesn't require anything from me today." What they say, "Something warming." What they mean, "I have been very cold in a way that has nothing to do with the weather." What they say, "Ruth's special blend, the one you made last time." What they mean, "I would like to feel the way I felt the last time I was here." Elena read this passage several times. She read it as a teacher. She had taught secondary school for 26 years, English and sometimes history, and recognized in it the same principle she had tried to teach her students about reading. The text is never only the text. What is said is only ever the surface of a thing. Beneath it runs everything the speaker has not found words for, or has found words for, but is not yet willing to say. Ruth had understood this, Ruth had built an entire profession around it. She turned the pages. There were notes on individual villages, written with great kindness and without a syllable of unkindness. Ruth had apparently not been a person given to private unkindness, which Elena thought was a more significant character achievement than most people recognized. There were notes on the seasons and how they affected what people needed. Autumn always brings the people who are carrying something that summer gave them no time to set down. Let them set it down here, and January is the loneliest month. Make the fire bigger than you need to in January, and leave the door open a little longer. There were notes on the blends themselves, amendments, refinements, substitutions when certain herbs were unavailable, thoughts on how a blend that worked in summer did not always work in winter and why. And interspersed among all of it, in no particular order, were sentences that were nothing to do with tea at all. The point of this shop is not the tea, and what people take away when they leave is not what they came in for. This is the whole point. And on the last page she read that night, Elena, if you're reading this in order, you're doing it too slowly. Skip to the middle. That's where I kept the things I most wanted you to find. Elena sat back in her chair and laughed. Oh, Ruth, she said to the empty kitchen. She turned to the middle of the notebook. She came in on a Saturday, late in the afternoon, when the shop was otherwise empty. A young woman of perhaps 19, with fair hair in a long plaid that she wore over one shoulder, and a flower on her apron, from the family bakery 2 doors down. She stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves with an expression that Eleanor recognized from her teaching years as the expression of someone who has come to do a thing and is now not certain they should have. Come in, Elena said from behind the counter. There's no requirement to buy anything. The girl came in, but stayed near the door. She looked at the shelves for a while without speaking. She was, Elena could see, not shy exactly. She had the self-possession of someone accustomed to hard work and practical responsibility. But she was carrying something that made her move carefully, as if she were afraid of jostling it. My mom said, Miss Ruth used to have something, she said at last, for when you were about to do something that frightened you, not something to make the fear go away, just something to make it easier to go ahead with it. Eleanor looked at the shelves. She knew the answer to this without having to search for it, because she had read all the labels now, and she'd been paying attention. Before you go, she said, 3rd shelf, left side. She didn't move to get it, because it seemed important that the girl reached for it herself. The girl walked to the shelves and found the jar. She held it, as people always did, with both hands. She read the label. Then she looked at Elena. What's in it? Rosemary, a little thyme, dried black currant skin, green tea, and roasted barley. Elena paused. Fruit's notes say it tastes like the morning of a long journey, when you'd were frightened and excited, and neither feeling entirely separate from the other. The girl was quiet for a moment. I'm leaving for Edinburgh in January. I want to study. Nobody here thinks it's a good idea. Not my parents. Not. She stopped. Anyway, will you stay? Elena said. I'll make a cup. The girl, Mira, she told Elena. Mira Lowe stayed for 40 minutes. They talked about Edinburgh and about the particular loneliness of being the only person in a place who wants a different kind of life, and about how that loneliness was not a failure. It was simply the cost of certain kinds of courage. Elena did not advise. She asked questions, and she listened, and she made a second cup from a different blend. This one called something new, which tasted of cardamom and cleurs, dried apple, and something bright that Elena still could not identify. When Mira left, she bought 2 jars, one for herself, one for her mother. There was a particular quality to Saturdays in Thornwick that Elena had not expected. They were busy in the particular low-key way of village Saturdays, which meant there was always someone coming in and always a pause between them, and the rhythm of it was something she was beginning to recognize as different from London's rhythm in every possible way. In London, busyness had been relentless. The pace of the street, the underground, the school corridors, where 500 young people moved in purposeful directions at all times. Here, the busyness had spaces in it like the pattern in good lace. Between Mrs. Fowler buying her weekly Assam and Thomas Hale collecting the blend, Ella had begun to set aside for him every Friday not 2 chairs by the fire, which he had taken the first time, but a new one, the last light of October, which she had simply felt was correct. There were intervals of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, in which the shop was still, and she could hear the wood pigeon in the elm tree, and the particular soft sound of the wind coming down off the mand. At 4 o'clock, she made another cup of the garden after rain, and sat at the table by the window, the village green in the last November light. She had lost track of the dates, but it was certainly November now. The mornings were dark when she rose, the frost thicker, was the color of pewter and dull gold, the chestnut tree nearly bare now, its few remaining leaves turning slowly in the wind. The lamp by the tree was already lit, though it was not yet dark. She held the cup and breathed the steam in first, as she had begun to do, as Ruth had noted in the margin of the recipe. Breathe it before you taste it. The intention is in the scent as much as the flavor. The smell was complex and settled, green and floral, and under it, the deepness of earth, clears, real earth, the kind that has been worked and rested and worked again. She thought about Ruth. She thought about what it meant to spend 40 years in one place, to learn the texture of a community, so thoroughly that you knew what each person needed before they said it. She thought about her own 26 years at the school in Camden, whether she had known her students that way, the quieter ones especially, the ones who carried things in silence. And she thought she had sometimes, not always, but sometimes, she thought the shop might be teaching her to do it more often. The tea cooled around her hands. The lamp on the green made a soft star in the dark window. She was beginning to think she might stay. Thomas Hale came back on a Tuesday, not his usual day. He was particular about his days. Ada had told her had been particular about them for as long as anyone could remember, and he came not to buy tea, but to bring a crate of last-season apples from his farm, which he sat on the kitchen table without being invited, and stood back and looked at as if assessing whether they would do. Clears, thought I'd have brought them sooner, he said. But the last 2 weeks, the picking was bad. These are the russetness. They'll last a while if you keep them cool. Miss Ruth always made something with them. I don't know what. Elena looked in the notebook that evening, and found the entry immediately. Thomas Hale brings russet apples every November without fail, without being asked, and without making it into anything. Use them in the autumn warm blend, dried apple peel, and in the kitchen. He'll have some of whatever you make, without being asked for his opinion, and not volunteering it. She made apple cake that evening, using a recipe from the tin box on the kitchen shelf above the one, which held, she had discovered, 20 years of handwritten recipes on folded cards, and the occasional scrap of brown paper, the kitchen filled with the smell of warm apple and cinnamon and brown sugar. And she left the back door ajar, because the evening was not too cold, and the smell she felt deserved to go further than just the kitchen. The next morning, at 8, before the shop opened, there was a knock at the back gate. It was Thomas. He held his flag cap in his hands. Smelled it, he said from the lane. Would you like a piece? He considered this for an appropriate length of time. Aye, he said, if it's no trouble. He sat at the kitchen table and ate 2 pieces of apple cake, with a cup of the 2 chairs by the fire, blend. She had not offered it, she had simply made it, and he did not say much. But the quality of his silence was different from the first time she had met him. The first time it had been watchful, now it was simply comfortable. The silence of someone who has decided they are in the right place, and has nothing to prove about it. He left with a piece wrapped in cloth for his supper. Elena stood at the kitchen window and watched him go up the lane, his broad shoulders set against the November morning, his flat cap back on, and thought about what Ruth had written in the notebook. The apples are his way of saying he is glad you are here. She had not believed it entirely at the time. She believed it now. Ada Pendleton had a habit of stopping by on Wednesday evenings after her rounds were done, and, Her coat was off, and she was, as she put it, officially finished with being useful to anyone other than herself. She would knock at the back gate and come in and put the kettle on before Elna had a chance to do it herself, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk until 8 o'clock, sometimes later, and Elena had come to recognize these evenings as one of the most reliable pleasures of her week. Ada talked with the generous, unself-conscious fluency of someone who has spent years listening to other people's concerns and has a great deal of her own to offer when given the opportunity. She talked about the village, its history, its opinions, its habits, its occasional stubborn wrong-headedness, and about her own life, which had been eventful in the particular way of small-town lives, a marriage that had not worked, but that she and her former husband had ended with dignity and occasional friendliness. 2 daughters, both now in Leeds, a mother in the cottage at the top of the lane, who was 91 and still sharper than most people half her age. She talked about Ruth, not sadly, but fully in the way of someone who had loved a person and was glad to talk about them. She told Elena things that filled in the spaces between the notebook entries. Ruth's characteristic cheerfulness on cold mornings, Ruth's absolute refusal to gossip. She would listen, Ada said, but she would never contribute, and after a while, people stopped trying. Ruth's habit of growing more herbs than she could possibly use, and distributing the excess, without ceremony, to anyone who walked past. In return, Elena talked about London. She talked about the school, and about the particular satisfaction of watching a student find the thing they were good at, and the particular frustration of being unable to help the ones who needed help, but had not yet learned how to receive it. She talked about James briefly, in the way she had learned to acknowledging his presence in her past, without requiring his presence in every conversation. One Wednesday, Ada said, "You're going to stay, aren't you?" Again, not a question. Elena poured the tea. Outside, the November wind moved in the elm tree. The range ticked warmly. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." Mrs. Fowler came in every Saturday, regular as the week itself, and bought her assam, clears, throat, and occasionally, when something in her bearing signaled that the week had been harder than usual, she sat at the window table and allowed herself to be made a cup of something else. She was not the sort of woman who asked for things. Eleanor had learned this quickly. She was the sort of woman who had spent 70 years managing well, and had acquired through this management a kind of dignity that she wore like good wool, warmth without ostentation. One Saturday in early December, she came in, and she was not quite herself. Elena noticed it in the way she set her bag on the counter, which was heavier than usual, and in the way her eyes went to the shelves rather than to Elena's face, which was her habit when she was looking for something she could not quite name. Elena did not ask what was wrong. She made the assam first, because that was the order of things, and then she made a second cup from a blend she had mixed herself. Her first, completely original blend, in fact made the previous week from a combination of Ruth's and S's notes and her own tentative instincts. She had not yet named it. She set it before Mrs. Fowler without explanation. Mrs. Fowler held it, breathed the steam, drank slowly. She was quiet for a long time. "This is new," she said at last. "My first attempt. What's in it?" Lapsang such, but very lightly smoked. Just enough for warmth without overwhelm. Dried rose hip, a little dried orange peel from the tree, and mother keeps dry blackberry leaf. She paused, and something Ruth had in a jar, labeled only as patience, which turned out to be very finely dried oat straw. "I thought it was interesting." Mrs. Fowler was quiet again. Then she said, "It tastes like the end of something difficult." Elena nodded. "That's what I hoped." Mrs. Fowler finished the cup without speaking. When she stood to go, she picked up her bag and held it for a moment, then said quietly, "My sister died on Thursday in Edinburgh. We hadn't spoken in 6 years." She said it not as a confession, but as a fact she had been carrying, and had decided to sat down, at least momentarily, at this table. "I'm very sorry," Elena said. Mrs. Swilda nodded once briskly the way she received things. What will you call it? Elena considered. I think, she said slowly, I'll call it after all. December came to the garden with a different quality than October or November had managed. October had been brisk and copper-colored, full of last efforts of beauty. The rose against the east wall, giving its final slightly desperate flowers, the mint still pungent if you brushed it with your hand. November had stripped things back methodically, the way a practical person clears a table after the guests have left. But December settled in with a quiet authority of something that intended to stay for a while and was comfortable with that intention. Elena kept going to the garden every morning, even when it was cold enough to see her breath, even when the frost made the flagstones slippery, and the herbs were reduced to their woody stalks, and the raised beds were covered in the straw. She had mulched them with one dry November afternoon, following instructions from Ruth. Notebook. She went because the morning needed marking, and because the garden was the clearest place she knew to mark it, and because the cold itself was, she had found, good for a certain quality of thinking, the kind that is not about reaching conclusions, but about simply allowing what is present to be present without demanding it become something else. She had planted the bulbs. Ruth's notebook had a whole page about this, dense with instruction and enthusiasm. December bulbs are an act of faith that does not require belief. You put them in, knowing spring will come, not because you can prove it from where you're standing, but because it always has. This is worth doing. Repeat every year. Elena had bought tulip and narcissus bulbs from the market in Harriet on a Thursday when she drove with Ada to collect supplies. She had planted them according to Ruth's specifications, which were detailed and slightly eccentric. Certain varieties had to be planted at particular depths. Certain ones preferred the east bed, and one type of narcissus, Ruth had written, should be planted near the door, because they come up earliest and are the first thing you see when you open the shop in March, and they will make you glad. She stood now in the cold December garden, her breath visible in the still air, and looked at the mulched beds and the bare soil where the bulbs were buried, and thought about spring, which was very far away, and felt the particular pleasure of something planned for and waited for, a pleasure she had lost somewhere in the middle of her London years, and had not expected to find again quite this readily. The wood pigeon cooled in the elm tree. Elena went inside and made tea. She found it on a Sunday evening in December, when the shop had been closed all day, and she had spent her afternoon in the particular productive idleness of sorting through the small room at the back of the cottage that served as a storage space. Not the shop storeroom, but a personal room. The walls lined with roots accumulated decades, boxes of letters tied with twine, stacks of old almanacs, a collection of botanical watercolors in a portfolio, seed catalogues annotated in margins. She had meant to just sort and tidy, but the afternoon had become something else, a long, slow archaeology of her grandmother's life, each box a different decade, each letter a voice she had not heard before. She was not reading them exactly, that felt like an intrusion, but she was noting their quality, the variety of hands, the postmarks from places as far as Edinburgh and once from India. Ruth had been Elena, was understanding more fully with each hour she spent in this cottage, a person of wide reach and deliberate presence, a person who had chosen this small village, not because the world was too large, but because she understood that a small place attended to well-contained as much of the world as a person could reasonably hold. And in the middle of the notebook, exactly where Ruth had told her to look, on a page she had apparently skipped in her orderly working through, she found what Ruth had left her. It was a folded piece of paper tucked into the binding. Not the small envelope for Mr. Graves. She still had that. She was not yet ready. But something different. A page torn from another notebook, covered in Ruth's handwriting, dated 3 months before she died. It said, "Elena, you're probably sitting in the kitchen, and you have probably made yourself a cup of something, and you have probably by now been in the village long enough to have stopped thinking about it as the village, and started thinking about it as home. If I am right about that, and I think I am, because you are more like me than either of us ever acknowledged when I was alive, then I have something to ask of you. The blends need continuing, but more than that, the practice needs continuing. The practice of paying attention, the practice of knowing what someone needs from a cup of tea, which is the same skill as knowing what someone needs from a life, which is a skill I think you have always had, and have not always had room to use. There is one blend I never finished. I call it in my private notes, not the ones on the shelf, the 51st blend. I don't know what it wants to be. I think it's been waiting for you. Look in the small blue tin on the second shelf of the storage room. You'll know what to do with what's it. Inside with more love than I managed to say while I was there to say it. Ruth. Elena sat on the floor of the storage room with a letter in her hands, and the afternoon, darkening around her, and did not bother about the tears that came, because they were the good kind, the kind that are not grief, not exactly, but the feeling of something received, at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right size. She found the blue tin exactly where Ruth had said it would be, on the second shelf of the storage room, behind 2 volumes of an old encyclopedia. It was a tea tin, though not one from the shop. It was older, its blue paint worn nearly away on the corners. A spray of painted flowers on its lid, so faded they were more suggestion than image. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth, she found 3 things. The first was a small quantity of a dried herb she did not immediately recognize. Dark green, fine-stemmed, with a smell that was clean and cold and faintly sweet, like the air at high altitude. She would need to look this up. The second was a handwritten card, not in Roos's hand, but in an older hand, more formal, with the wider spacing of Victorian copper plate, from the garden at Hawthorne House, 1849, planted by E.M., for whoever comes after. Eleanor stared at the initials for a moment. E.M. Eleanor Marsh. She felt a very slight, unmistakable prickling at the back of her neck. The third was a key. It was smaller than the shop key, bright brass rather than iron, and it had a tag tied to it, with a piece of faded ribbon, on which was written in Roos hand, the small cabinet right side of the shop, behind the wool curtain. I shall have shown you sooner. I kept meaning to. Eleanor sat with a tin in her lap, and looked at the 3 objects for a long time. Then she put the cloth back over them, carefully, closed the lid, and took the tin with her downstairs to the shop. Behind the wool curtain, a heavy green curtain she had assumed concealed a section of shelving, was a small door set into the stone wall. The brass key fit perfectly. The cabinet inside was shallow, lined in cedar wood, and held a single shelf. And on the shelf was a row of very small glass vials, each sealed with wax, each labeled in a different hand, each hand different from the last. The labels on the vials read, not names, clears, throat, or descriptions, but single words, beginning, patience, returning, forgiveness, continuance. Beneath the shelf, a folded card in Ruth's handwriting. These are what the blends are really made of, not the herbs. These keep them, and keep what they mean. And the 51st blend will know when it's ready. Eleanor had not celebrated Christmas with any particular enthusiasm since James. The holiday had always been his province. He had been the one who remembered to buy a tree, who tracked down the particular chocolates that went in stockings, who called relatives with the cheerful reliability of someone who actually liked doing it. Without him, Christmas had become something to be navigated rather than celebrated, reduced to a day of adequate food and a long walk and an early night. Thornwick, she discovered, did not leave room for this approach. The village decorated itself in December with the unhurried thoroughness of a community that has been doing this for a very long time, and has decided the way it has always been done is also the best way. Wreaths appeared on doors, real ones of holly and ivy, and rose hips made by Mrs. Moons. Fowler and her committee, with a focused competence of a well-staffed military operation. The green was given a bonfire on the winter solstice, which everyone attended, and around which everyone stood in coats and scarves, drinking something hot from a large pot that Thomas Hale carried down from his farm every year and refused to describe as anything other than a family recipe. Ada organized the carol singing, which she did with a brisk cheerfulness that did not brook objection. "You'll come," she told Eleanor on the 20th of December. Not as a question, everyone comes, even Thomas comes, and he thinks singing is fundamentally suspicious. Eleanor came. She stood in the lamplight around the green, with 30 people she had now met, and some she was still learning, and sang the old carols that she knew by heart from childhood and had not sung in years, and felt the words reshape themselves in her throat into something more honest than they had allowed been the last time she had used them. Afterward, she opened the shop for an hour with a fire built high, and every oil lamp lit, and 6 different blends on offer, labeled with small cards she had made herself. People came in from the cold, 2 and 3 at a time, and stood with their cups and their coats still on, and filled the small room with warmth and conversation, and the particular laughter of people who were pleased to be where they are. At 11 o'clock, she locked the shop door and stood for a moment on the step, looking at the village green. In the last of the evening, the frost was coming. The stars were very sharp. She had not spent Christmas here since she was 7 years old. She had the feeling, which she had learned by now, to trust, that she would not leave again. January arrived as it always does in Yorkshire, without ceremony, without apology, and with a determination to be itself rather than a continuation of what came before. The warmth and light of Christmas was replaced by a grey that was not unkind, but was thorough, the grey of stone and low cloud and bare fields, and the particular pewter quality of afternoon light that has never quite managed to become morning. Eleanor found she liked it. She had not expected to. In London, she had endured January. Here she found she had the material for a different relationship with it. The shop was quieter, fewer people in winter, some people she had not seen since autumn, the village pulling inward in the way of all northern places. When the cold comes, but those who came seemed to come with more intention, as if the cold required you to mean what you were doing, and the cups of tea they drank seemed to warm them in ways that the summer cups had not needed to bother with. She worked on the 51st blend, not urgently. She had learned from Ruth's notebook that urgency was the enemy of good tea, that a blend, attempted in haste, produced something that was technically correct and entirely inadequate. But steadily, the way you might work on a piece of music you are learning by heart, a little every morning, usually before the shop opened, at the kitchen table with a notebook and the blue tin beside her, and a cup of something else to compare against. She had identified the unfamiliar herb from the tin. It was sweet woodruff, dried, rare in cultivation, but occasionally found in old gardens. The card in Ruth's hand had confirmed this when she looked it up in one of the botanical volumes on the shelf. For the blend that needs to feel like coming home, Ruth had written in a separate note she found tucked in the encyclopedia beside the entry. Sweet woodruff carries the scent of new mown hay and vanilla, but only fully releases when dried. Like many things, it takes time to become what it is. Eleanor dried a small additional quantity of the woodruff from the tin. She experimented with proportions. She made cups she did not think were right, and drank them thoughtfully, and took notes in the margins of Ruth's notebook, clears, using a different color ink, so they were clearly hers. She was not in a hurry. The January days passed, grey and still, and entirely their own kind of beautiful. It happened in February, which was the month Eleanor had come to think of as Thomas's month. He came more often in February than at any other time, always in the morning, always before the other customers arrived, and she had the impression that this was how he preferred it, that the shop in its quiet, pre-opening state was the place and the time he was most willing to say things. He told her on a February morning, when the wind was coming strongly off the moor, and rattling the cat shop window, about Ruth, about his mother first. She had been Thomas's mother's closest friend. Ruth had from the time they were girls, and the friendship had lasted longer than Thomas's mother's life, which was not a long one, and about how after his mother was gone, Ruth had simply continued being present, stopping in the way she stopped for everyone, making the particular cup she made for him, listening. She never tried to make it better, Thomas said, which was the longest sentence Elelana had heard him produce. He was looking at the table, not at her. She just let it be what it was, and sat with it alongside you. I don't think most people know how to do that. Elelana thought of the notebook. What they need is not comfort. Comfort implies the difficult things should not have happened. What they need is company. She taught me a lot, Elena said, without being here to do it. Thomas looked up at her briefly with a dark eyes that said rather more than the voice. Then he looked back at his cup. After a moment, he said, "What is this one?" "I called it February Morning," she said, "though it's not finished yet. This is the third version." He drank it slowly and said nothing for a while. Then the first version was too sharp. The second was closer. "This one." He stopped. "This one won. This one tastes like something you didn't know you'd been waiting for." He looked slightly surprised at himself for having said it, and she did not press it further, and they sat in the comfortable, practiced silence of people who no longer needed to fill the space between them. By the time February was properly underway, Elelana had served tea to every person in the village at least once. She kept a quiet acquired record of this, not the notebook kind, but the mental kind, a map of the community that was building itself gradually in her understanding. She knew now that Mrs. Fowler played chess by herself on Sunday evenings, and that the ritual had begun because her husband, 20 years dead, had been her chess partner, and she had refused to stop. She knew that Ada's mother, 91, and perfectly alert, had grown up in this village and had never once left it, and considered this not a limitation, but a thorough commitment. She knew that the young couple in the cottage on the north side of the green had married 3 years ago, and were trying quietly, and with considerable courage, to have a child, and that the wife, a small dark-haired woman called Frances, came in every Thursday for a cup of the garden, after rain, and stayed until she was ready to go back into her own life, with what Elena could only describe as renewed stores of gentleness toward it. She knew that the postman who covered the Western Road, a man of 60 called Gerald, had been writing a novel for 11 years and had never shown it to anyone, and that he came in on Tuesdays with a plain Assam, and occasionally, when he thought no one was looking, traced the labels on the tea jars with one finger, as if committing them to memory. She knew that Mera Lowe, who was still in the village through the winter, Edinburgh in January, she had said, came in twice a week, and was getting ready. Elna could see it in the way she stood now, differently than in autumn, with a quality of intention that had consolidated from anxiety into something more like direction. She made each of them what they needed. She got it wrong sometimes. She noted this honestly in the notebook, and on those occasions she said so, and tried again. And no one seemed to mind, because the try was visible, and because the shop she was understanding, more clearly each week, was not a place where perfection was the point. The point was the attention. Frances came in on a Thursday in February, when the frost was deep, and the village was very still, and she did not order the usual cup, but stood at the counter and looked at the shelves for a long time before turning to Elelana with an expression that was Clear's throat, careful and slightly braced. "I need something I've never tried before," she said. "I need something for I don't know how to say it. For the space between trying and knowing, when you've done what you can, and it's out of your hands, and you just have to wait, and the waiting is the hardest part, because you want so much, and you can't do anything more about it." Elena did not say anything immediately. She had the strong sense that this was a moment that required the same quality of respect as record. Thomas's silences, the respect of not rushing, of allowing the weight of what had been said to rest in the air for a moment before it was addressed. Then she turned to the shelves and looked. She looked for a full minute, which in a small shop is a long time. Then she reached for a jar she had not touched before. It was near the top of the far right shelves, one of the oldest ones, the label slightly yellowed. Patient waiting, it said, in Ruth's hand. But the date beneath it was earlier than most of the others. She took it down and brought it to the counter. Ruth made this, she said. I haven't offered it before, because I wasn't sure when it was right to. I think it might be right now. She made the cup carefully, following Ruth's precise instructions in the notebook. The blend was delicate, white tea, very lightly processed with dried jasmine and what Ruth had described as a very small amount of dried cherry blossom, the kind that has already done its blooming and is at rest. The cup, when it came, was pale and fragrant and very soft. Frances held it in both hands and said nothing. She drank slowly. She stayed for an hour. She did not explain more than she had said at the counter, and Elelena did not ask, or when she left, she held Elelena's hand for a moment at the door very briefly and said, "Thank you." 3 weeks later, she came back beaming. Elelena had the tea ready before she reached the counter, something new, and they both already knew what it was for. Elelena had now made the 51st blend 7 times in 7 different configurations, and she had noted each one carefully in the notebook and described what it lacked or offered. And she was close now. She could feel the proximity of the right thing. The way you feel the proximity of an answer you have been working toward over a long period of time, the quality of it as something about to arrive. She made herself a cup of the 7th version on a Saturday morning before the shop opened, when the village was still in its early morning quiet, and the light was the particular blue of late February dawning, and she sat at the window and held the cup and breathed the steam in first. It was the best yet. The sweet woodruff was right at last, not too forward, not lost. But there, beneath the other notes, the way a good foundation is not noticed but is felt. The green tea she had replaced in this version with a Taiwanese oolong she had found in a small canister at the back of Ruth's storeroom with a note attached. For when you're ready to add this, which was either prescient or simply good storage practice on Ruth's part, and she had decided not to try to determine which the oolong brought a depth that the previous versions had lacked. At Aronis, the dried apple peel from Thomas's russetsness added warmth. The chamomile added openness. She drank the cup slowly, sitting in the February morning, watching the village green lighten as Clear's throat the sun came up behind the church. It tasted, she thought, like the middle of something, rather than the beginning or the end. Not arrival, not departure, the long, quiet, essential middle. The part of a life that is not dramatic, but that is, when you attend to it, full of everything that matters. She picked up her pen and wrote in the notebook in her own ink. I think this is the one. Version 7, the 51st blend. I'll let it rest for a week, and then make it again, and see if I still think so. She thought she still would. The morning Mira Lowe left for Edinburgh was a Thursday at the end of February, cold and bright, and the kind of morning that is not warm, but is full of light, that has the quality of a promise. Elelena had known it was coming. Mira Clear's throat had told her the date 3 weeks earlier, and had come in twice since then, with the increasing steadiness of someone who has made their decision and is now simply moving toward it. She came at 8 o'clock, before the shop was open, with a small trunk on wheels and a rucksack, and her plait, pinned up in a new way that made her look simultaneously older and more like herself. She knocked at the back gate, the way people who came as friends rather than customers had taken to doing. Elelena had the tea ready before you go, which was what Mira had asked for the first time, whom they had talked, which felt now like the right ending to that beginning. They sat in the kitchen and drank it, and it tasted, Elelena noted this for the notebook later, exactly as she had described it to Mira on that first Saturday, like the morning of a long journey, when frightened and excited are the same thing. My mother cried this morning, Mira said, which was she's not a crier. So will you come back for Christmas and summers? Probably. She looked at her cup. It's different now, you know, coming back now that it's a choice. She looked up. I think that's what you gave me. Not courage exactly, more like it showed me the difference between staying because you'd afraid to go, and staying because you mean it, and going because you mean it. Elena said nothing, because nothing was required. She refilled the cup. Mira drank it. They sat in the kitchen of the shop that smelled the decades of tea and dried herbs and good mornings. At 8:15, Mira picked up her rucksack and kissed Elena on the cheek, which surprised both of them slightly, and went out the back gate. While Elena heard the wheels of the trunk on the lane cobbles getting quieter, and then the village quiet filled back in, around the space where the sound had been. She washed the 2 cups. She opened the shop. March arrived with a quality of impatience it had clearly been saving up. The frost retreated overnight from a Tuesday to a Wednesday, and by Thursday the garden was changed. The narcissus Elena had planted under Ruth's instructions were up. She had gone out that Thursday morning and found them spears of green against the mulch, 3 in high, with the particular insistence of things that had been waiting a long time, and are now finally getting on with it. She stood in the garden and looked at them for a long time without speaking. The morning was still cool, but the cold had changed its character. It was the cold of early rather than late, of something beginning rather than enduring. The sky above the stone walls was a blue she had not seen since October, and there was a smell in the air that was indefinable. The smell of the ground deciding to be warm again, to start moving the things it had been holding. Still, she went in and made tea, not for herself, not yet, but for the opening of the shop. And while she waited for the water to heat, she looked at the narcissus through the kitchen window and thought simply of Ruth, of the deliberateness of planting something you will not see bloom, of the trust that the ground will hold it, that the cold will not be final, that the person who comes after will open the back door one March morning and find it waiting. Reverend Birch came in at his usual Tuesday time, and she told him about the narcissus, and he nodded and said she planted new bulbs every October without fail for 40 years. I asked her once why she bothered, given she had a full garden, and she said because someone should. He paused. She was talking about more than the bulbs. I know. Elena said she knew she'd go before she wanted to. He said she was at peace with it. What she was not at peace with was leaving things she clears hadn't passed on. You were the thing she hadn't passed on. Elena held her cup in both hands. Outside through the window, the March morning was bright and mild, and the narcissus were green. She passed it on. Elena said on the first Saturday of March, she made it again. Version 8, though it was the same as version 7, because she had decided it was right. And this was simply the confirmation, the way you read a sentence aloud to make sure it sounds the masterful way you intended before you commit it to the final page. The morning was everything. The 51st blend needed. Sunlight coming through the shop window, cold and clean. The shop empty and quiet before opening time. The narcissus in the garden, just visible through the kitchen doorway, yellow now, 3 of them open. She had spent an hour in the garden at dawn, and she had brought in a single stem and put it in a small glass of water on the kitchen table. She measured carefully. Green oolong, loose leaf, 4 grams. Sweet woodruff, dried, 1 gram. Chamomile flowers, 3. Dried apple peel, a small curl, a tiny scraping of dried vanilla pod, her own addition, not in Rue's notes. Something she had tried in version 6 on instinct, and had not removed since. And from the blue tin, the last ingredient, a small amount of the sweet woodruff from the original packet, the herb that carried M's initial 1849. Not enough to change the taste. Enough to mean something. The water had just below the boil. 5 minutes. She had decided this blend needed 5. She set the timer. She sat down. She looked at the narcissist in the glass. She thought about Thornwick, and about all the people she had made tea for, and what they had needed, and what they had found. She thought about Ruth, who had spent 40 years attending to this place, and about the unnamed M, who had planted something in 1849 that had survived to this morning. She thought about what it meant to receive something and to continue it, and how that was different from simply keeping it the same. How continuation was not preservation, but a kind of faithful development. It choosing to tend. The timer ran. She poured. The cup was golden and clear, and smelled of the garden and the morning, and something deeper, that she did not try to name. She drank. It was right. She sat very still for a moment, receiving it. The way you receive something you have been waiting for, with patience, and without knowing exactly what you were waiting for. She picked up her pen. She wrote the recipe on a clean page of the notebook, neatly, with a new heading. The 51st Blend, by Elena Marsh, March 1885, and below the recipe, in smaller letters, for whatever you came here for. She put the 51st Blend on the shelf on the first Monday of April, in a new jar, slightly larger than most of the others, with a label she had written twice, Clears, before she was satisfied with the handwriting, and placed it at the end of the second shelf from the top, where the light from the window caught it in the morning. She did not tell anyone what it was. She waited to see if anyone would ask. Thomas Hale came in on his Wednesday, and walked along the shelves as he always did now, not buying but looking, the way a person looks at a familiar room to see what has changed. He stopped at the new jar. He read the label. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, new, she said. He took it from the shelf and held it. He looked at the label which read for whatever you came here for. In Elena's careful hand, he put it back on the shelf. It's right that he said for this place. Ada's response was more immediate. She came in the next morning and spotted it within 30 seconds and demanded a cup which Elena made with the gratified pleasure of someone who has been waiting to offer something and has too finally been asked. Ada drank it without speaking, which was unusual enough to be notable. Then she said, "Right. Well, this is the one, isn't it?" "I think so." She would have. Yes. Ada didn't finish the sentence. She picked up her cup and looked at it. She would have been so pleased. They sat in the morning shop with the April light coming through the window and the narcissus on the sill. Elena had brought them in from the garden and put them in a long white jug, and the smell of the new blend still in the air, which was all the things she had put in it, and more than the sum of them. By June, the garden was extraordinary. Elena had not planned it to be extraordinary. She had planned to maintain it, to continue what Ruth had begun, to keep the herb beds going, and the back wall rows in good order. But the garden apparently had decided to express itself. The mint had spread in 3 directions. The chamomile was thick along the south wall, white-flowered, and producing more than she could use. So she had taken to drying it in large flat trays in the sunny upstairs bedroom, and the whole cottage smelled of it in the warm evenings. A smell that was not quite floral, and not quite medicinal, but somewhere between the two, and entirely its own thing. The rose against the east wall, the old one, dark pink rose-specific rose, was the most extravagant it had apparently been in years, according to Mrs. Fowler, who had been observing it for 30 years, and had opinions about his cycles. Elena sat in the garden every afternoon, between 4 and 5, when the shop had its quietest hour, and she could leave it with the door ajar and hear if anyone came in. She sat in Ruth's chair, which was still the best chair, and she did her reading there, the botanical volumes from the storage room. A growing correspondence with a herb list in Edinburgh that Ada had found through a friend of a friend, seed catalogues for next year, and she drank whatever the afternoon offered. The village came to the back gate sometimes in summer, the way neighbours do when the season is warm and doors and gates are naturally open. Francis brought strawberries one Tuesday wordlessly, and Elena made a cup of the garden in September, which she had decided was equally appropriate for June, Clears, and they sat side by side in the warm garden and did not need to explain to each other why they were content. Thomas Hale came and looked at the chamomile beds without speaking, and then said she'd have been out here every morning. She was, Elena said. He looked at her. You know that she wrote about it in the notebook. He nodded slowly. She wrote about everything. She told me once that writing things down was how she kept them. He paused. How she kept the people. Eleanor thought about this for the rest of the day. A letter arrived from Edinburgh in July, forwarded by Ada with a wink, and set on the kitchen table, where Eleanor would find it with her morning tea. It was 3 pages in Mera's handwriting, which was nothing like Ruth's, small and dense and slightly hurried with corrections written above lines rather than beside them. The handwriting of someone whose thoughts move faster than her pen. Mera described Edinburgh with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that the world is in fact as large and interesting as they had hoped, and not as part of them had feared, simply a different arrangement of the same limitations. She described her studies. She was reading English literature, which surprised Eleanor not at all, and her hall of Conta, residents, and the other students, and the city, in all its grey and golden complexity. But the middle of the letter, which Eleanor read twice, was this: I have a friend here who is having a very bad time, and I took her to my room, and I made her a cup of tea, and I found myself thinking about what you would do. Not the tea exactly. I only have Yorkshire gold. I haven't your grandmother's jars, but the way of it, the paying attention, the sitting with it, instead of trying to fix it. I think it actually helped. I think I did it right. I wanted to tell you because you're the reason I know how. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer of the kitchen table, which had become the drawer for things worth keeping. She made herself a cup of something new, which was, she had decided, equally appropriate for things that were new and things that were also in some way already known. She wrote back that evening. She told Mera she had done exactly right. On a Tuesday in August, Reverend Burge did something he had not done in 31 Tuesdays of sitting in the corner of the shop. He brought a book. He set it on the table when Eleanor brought his cup. She was giving him the 51st blend now every week, because it was the one that felt most suited to someone who came without asking for anything and needed only to be in a place that attended to things carefully. He set the book on the table with a gesture that was slightly tentative for someone of his composure. I've been reading this again, he said. He pushed it across the table slightly, an invitation rather than a directive. She picked it up. It was the slim poetry volume she had first seen on the bedside table in Ruth's room, the same copy she was fairly certain, with the same soft cover and the same pencil marks in the margins. The poet's name, Clara Vane. She opened it and read a stanza at random, which was about the way light falls in late afternoon, through glass that has been standing for 100 years. Acquiring the poem said the particular quality of old patience. It was exactly as good as that sounds. She and Ruth were friends, Reverend Birch said from girlhood. Clara moved away eventually. They wrote for years. Eleanor turned to the front page. An inscription for Ruth, who taught me that the best things are not said but offered. CV 1858. She died in 1871. He said Ruth kept the book on the bedside table for the rest of her life. He looked at his cup. I thought you should have it. Eleanor held the book for a moment. Then she stood and carried it to the shop and placed it on the small shelf below the counter where Ruth had kept her favorite things: a smooth piece of manstone, a small wooden box, and the sand timer from the kitchen, and it sat there, an addition to the collection of what mattered in this place. She made Reverend Birch a second cup without being asked. He accepted it without surprise. October came again. Not the October she had arrived in, nervous and provisional, carrying 2 bags and an unopened envelope, but October as clear's throat, something she now knew the quality of, the specific light, the specific cold, the way the chestnut tree on the green began its slow release of leaves, each one turning as if considering its options before deciding. She had been in Thornwick for a year. She marked it privately on a Wednesday evening after Ada had gone home by making herself a cup of the garden after rain, the blend she had made her first night following Ruth's instruction, and sitting in the shop by the window. The shop was closed. The fire was low. The oil lamp on the table made its quiet amber world. She thought about the year, she thought about the people she had come to know, and the blends she had made for them, and the ones she had made wrong, and the ones she had eventually got right. She thought about Thomas and Ada, and Reverend Birch, and Francis, and Mira, and Mrs. Fowler, and all the others, the full complement of a small village, 200 souls or thereabouts, each one a world as large as any city contained in a stone house, in a daily life, in a cup of tea taken at a particular time of day, for a particular reason that they might not have words for, but that she was learning gradually to recognize. She had not opened the small envelope yet, the one from Mr. Graves, the one Ruth had asked to be given to her at the right time, she thought, sitting in the Lampid shop on the anniversary of her arrival, that she had perhaps she'd been waiting until she was sure enough of this place to receive whatever it contained. She was sure now. She reached into the pocket of her shawl, where she had carried it, these 12 months without quite acknowledging that she had. She put it on the table. She looked at it. She would open it tonight. Inside the envelope was a single folded piece of paper, and inside the paper was a key, not the brass key to the small cabinet which she had found in the blue tin. A different key, smaller, silver, with a delicate bow shaped like a snowdrop, and around the snowdrop bow, tied in a thread so fine she had not noticed it at first, was a small card on which was written in a hand she did not recognize, which was very old indeed. Copper plate, formal, the handwriting of the previous century. For the one who comes after, with all my faith in the continuation. E.M. She sat with the key in her palm, and read the card 3 times. M again, Elena Marsh, her own initials. She unfolded the paper. This one was from Ruth, undated, but the handwriting was shakier than the rest, suggesting it had been written toward the end. It said the key belongs to the small rosewood box in the blue tin. You've seen the box but not opened it. I think you were waiting for this. It will tell you what it is when you open it. What it tells you, I think, will explain the initial. I didn't name you Ella Lenana by accident. She was my grandmother's grandmother, and she made the first tea garden behind the shop in 1849. She believed, as I believe, as I hope you will believe, that some things are not coincidences, but inheritances. Open the box on a quiet evening. Don't rush. Eleanor looked at the small rosewood box she had set aside weeks ago, having noticed it in the blue tin, without yet feeling the moment was right. It sat on the mantelpiece above the kitchen range, small and dark, the grain of the wood, the warm red of old polished furniture. She brought it to the table. The silver key fit perfectly. She opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 things: a dried flower, unidentifiable now, pressed flat, pale brown with age, and a folded card in that same copper plate hand. She opened the card. To whoever you are, I planted sweet woodruff in the garden in my 81st year because my grandmother planted it in hers, and because it seemed important to continue the things that asked to be continued. I did not know you, but I knew you would come make something good with what I left. That is all inheritance asks. Eleanor Marsh, 1849. Eleanor sat very still for a long time. Then she looked up at the kitchen window, and beyond it, the October evening sky, and felt the fine, unbreakable thread of it. Not haunting, not mystical, simply the extraordinary ordinary fact of time and care and the bare things that are passed on hand to hand through the length of years to the people who are ready to station. The morning after she walked through Thornwick with new eyes, or rather with the same eyes she had always had, but a different sense of what she was looking with them at. The village in October was exactly as it had been year ago when she arrived. The chestnut tree, the frost, the stone walls, the particular quality of the light pooling in the valleys, and also entirely different because now she knew what she was walking through, not just a village, a continuance. Mrs. Fowler was sweeping her path when Elelana passed and said good morning with her customary exactness, and Elelana said good morning back and thought, here is someone who has lived in this place for 70 years, who carries the whole weight of its history in her memory, who is herself a part of what this place has accumulated. Thomas Hale, visible at the far end of the lane, checking the top stones of his wall in the early morning way he had, was another decade. Ada, delivering her morning round, with her coat insufficiently buttoned, and her hair already half escaped from its pins, was another. Reverend Birch, whose footsteps Elelena could hear on the gravel path to the church, was 30 years of Tuesday afternoons. She was part of it now too. This was, she understood, standing in the October lane, with the morning cold on her face, what Ruth had been trying to give her. Not just a shop, not just a trade, but a position in something ongoing, a place in a continuance. She went back to the shop and opened it. The narcissus bulbs were in the ground by 10. The second Christmas in Thornwick was different from the first, in the way that second times always are, not lesser, but familiar, and familiarity with the right things is a form of richness. She knew now where to stand at the carol, singing for the best acoustics, slightly to the left of the chestnut tree, where the sound bounced off the church wall in a way that made even the less musical voices seem harmonious. She knew that Thomas would arrive at the bonfire carrying his pot of something warm exactly 15 minutes before it started, and would set it on the low wall and ladle cups, without looking at anyone, and that everyone would take a cup without making it into anything, and that this was exactly the right arrangement. She knew that Mrs. Fowler's wreath this year would have more rose hips than last year's, because Mrs. Fowler had remarked in October that last year's had not had enough, and Mrs. Fowler's remarks were always, in some sense, plans. She made the 51st blend in large quantities for the Christmas opening, and it was the first time she had offered it broadly, rather than as something specifically chosen for a specific person, and she watched how people received it. Mostly, they received it the way you receive something that meets you where you are, a small stillness, a slight settling, and then the conversation continuing, but subtly differently, a little more present than before. Ada, accepting her cup on Christmas Eve, after the shop had otherwise closed, said, "Do you know what this tastes like? Tell me." "It tastes like arriving somewhere you've been going without knowing it." Eleanor considered this. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it's for." Frances came in on a February Thursday, carrying a child on her hip, a daughter 7 months old, dark-haired, and watchful in the way of babies who take everything in seriously. She came to the counter and said without preamble, "She's called Ruth." Elelena was quiet for a moment. "Does she know that yet?" Frances laughed. A real free laugh, the kind Elelena had not heard from her in the careful months of the year before. "Not yet, but I think she'll appreciate it." She shifted the baby. "We wanted to ask if you'd be her godmother. We know you're not." She stopped. "I mean, we haven't known you very long, by some measures." "By other measures," Elelena said. "By other measures." Frances smiled. "By the measures that actually matter. We've known you long enough." Eleanor made a cup of tea one-handed and held the baby with the other, which was not something she had done in a very long time, and found that the weight of a small person in the crook of your arm was one of the most ordinary, extraordinary things in the world. The baby looked at her with the dark, considering eyes. She looked back. "Yes," Elelena said to Frances, "I'd be honored." On the Sunday after she became godmother to Ruth Lowe, née Warren, they had given her the middle name Lowe for Frances's family. And Ruth, for the obvious reason, Elena made herself a cup of a quiet Sunday, which she had sold many times, but had not herself drunk since the notebook years ago. The recipe called for a blend she had not examined closely, oolong and dried pear, and a very small amount of dried violet, which Ruth had grown in the north bed, and which produced flowers of a color so specific to itself that it had no other name than violet. The violet dried, lost its color entirely, but kept something else. The particular sweetness of it, not sugary, but botanical, the sweetness of something that exists because it has no reason not to. She made it at 8 in the morning, when the village was still entirely quiet, when even the wood pigeon had not yet reported for duty, and the elm tree stood in the still air without moving. She sat at the window table in her dressing gown, which she had not done before, had always dressed before the shop. But this was Sunday, and the shop was not open, and she felt for the first time perhaps in her adult life that the wearing of a dressing gown in the morning was not a failure of discipline, but a form of self-knowledge. The tea was, as the name suggested, quiet. It did not make announcements. It sat in the cup, and was itself, and asked nothing. Eleanor sat in the Sunday morning, how was herself, and asked nothing. The elm tree eventually stirred in a small breeze. The wood pigeon arrived, slightly laid, and began. The frost on the windowsill began to melt in the first thin sun. She held the cup, and felt very precisely and simply at home. Ada's mother, whose name was Dorothy, and who was 92 by the spring of the second full year, came into the shop for the first time in March. She had never come before, Ada told Eleanor. Not in all the years Ruth had run it. Not because she didn't want to, but because Ruth had always gone to her, which was a different arrangement, and one that had suited both of them. She came slowly with a stick, and stood in the door for a moment, and looked at the shelves with the expression of someone revisiting something. Then she said she never moved anything. No, Eleanor said, I've only added. Dorothy walked to the shelves, and moved along them in the particular way of someone reading. She was small and slightly bent, but her eyes were sharp, and her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone with a great deal still left to say. I remember when she started, Dorothy said. She was younger than you are now. She'd had a difficult year, her husband, and then some other things, and she decided that what she was going to do was learn the herbs, and learn the people, and learn how to give one to the other. I thought she was mad. She paused. I was wrong. I'm often wrong. I tend to be wrong when people are braver than I expect. She accepted a cup. Eleanor gave her. Everything will be all right. The label slightly faded. The first jar Eleanor had ever picked up in this shop on her first evening, and sat at the window table for an hour. She talked about Ruth, about the village as it had been, about the things that had stayed the same, and the things that had quietly changed, about what it meant to watch a place for 92 years. When she left, she paused at the door, and turned back. You've got her quality, she said. The same one, the one of being fully where you are. She tapped her stick on the threshold. Don't lose it. It's rarer than you think. She began to teach in the second summer, without planning to. It happened because Mira came back from Edinburgh for July, and came directly to the garden as she now always did, and sat in the extra chair Eleanor had brought out, and said, Tell me what everything is. So Eleanor told her. She told her what chamomile was for, and how it grew, and what it smelled like at different points in the season, and what the dried version lost, and what it kept. She told her about sweet woodruff, and its long-releasing fragrance, and its patience. She told her about lemon balm, and why it was sometimes called melissa, and why that mattered, which was because melissa was the Greek word for bee, and the bees knew something about it that the other insects didn't. And if you stood by the lemon balm bed on a still afternoon, you could hear the particular quality of that knowing. Mira took notes. She was studying literature, yes, but she was also, Eleanor could see it building in her across these conversations, beginning to understand that boaty and literature were not separate things, that both were about the careful naming of what is observed, the attempt to find words adequate to what exists. By the end of July, Mira was making her own blends, small ones, tentative, at the kitchen table in the evenings. She did not name them yet. Eleanor did not suggest she should. Naming was for when you knew what you had. The garden in July was its warmest, most extravagant self. The smell of it, when you stood near the gate, enough to tell you, without entering, that something good was happening inside. October came again, and brought with it the particular quality that Eleanor now knew was October's own. The sense of the year gathering itself, of things that had grown all summer, preparing to let go with a grace that was also a form of generosity. She harvested the herbs with more confidence this year. She knew what she was cutting, and where to cut, and how much to leave for next year. And she had the particular pleasure of skilled repetition, the pleasure not of doing something for the first time, which is the pleasure of discovery, but of doing something again, with the full understanding of what you were doing. She tied the bundles, and hung them from the frame along the south wall, as she had found them when she arrived. And standing in the October garden looking at them, she thought that this was what it looked like. The passing on of a practice, not the same, but not different, continued. Thomas brought apples. She made cake. He ate it at the kitchen table, and said, after a long, comfortable silence, "You'll be here next year." "I will," she said. "And the year after, and the year after." He nodded, as if confirming something he'd been certain of for some time, and was simply registering aloud. He finished his cake. He left. She looked at the October garden from the kitchen window, and thought about next year with a particular pleasure of someone who has next year, that is specific, and real, and full of things she is looking forward to. One November morning, a Tuesday, his day, his reliable Tuesday, Thomas came in and sat down without collecting his usual blend, which was sufficiently unusual for Elena to notice without commenting. She made him the 51st blend, because it was the one that seemed this morning, right? He drank half of it, and then said, "I've been thinking about what you told me about the notebook, about what she wrote about people." "What specifically?" He considered. "She wrote about people with, I don't know the word, with kindness in it. Not soft, exact. She saw exactly what people were, and wrote it down without making it mean anything other than what it was." He looked at his cup. "I've never been good at that. I see things, and I make them mean something they don't mean. I make them mean trouble mostly." Elena did not say anything. She had learned from Ruth's notebook, and from her own year of practice, that some things required a space around them rather than a response. "She once wrote about me," he said. "I didn't know when she was alive. I read it this past year. Ada told me there was a copy." He paused. "She said I was the best kind of person in a place like this. The kind who holds the walls up just by being here. The kind who doesn't ask for acknowledgement, and doesn't need clears throat it and does it anyway." He looked at Elena. "I didn't know she thought that." "I think," Elena said carefully, "that the reason she didn't tell you was not that she forgot, but that she knew you would hold it better if you found it later, when you were ready to receive it." Thomas looked at this thought from several angles. Then he finished his cup. "She was clever," he said. "Your grandmother?" "Yes," Elena said. "She was." There were nights in the second winter when Elena stayed in the shop after closing, not for any particular reason, but for the particular quality of it. The shop at night was different from the shop in the day, in the way that any well-used room is, different when the people have gone home. Not empty, exactly, full of their absence, which is a different thing. She would sit at the window table, with a cup of something she had not planned in advance, and simply be in the room. The oil lamp, the fire, the shelves of jars with their labels she now knew by heart, the small rosewood box on the mantelpiece, the poetry volume on the shelf below the counter, the sand timer, the smooth manstone. She would think sometimes about the accumulation of all the cups of tea that had been drunk in this room, not just in her time here, but in Ruth's, and before that, in whoever had run the shop before Ruth, and further back than that, because the building was old, and had been many things before it became a tea shop, and all of that time it had been in this village, and the village had been going on around it. She thought about all the people who had come in frightened, and left a little steadier, all the people who had come in lonely, and sat at the table for 20 minutes in company, and then gone home slightly less, though all the people who had come in, not knowing what they needed, and left with a jar of something that turned out to be exactly right. She thought about the 51st blend on its shelf, still surprising her, the way it met people differently each time, the way it seemed always to find the particular quality of what they had brought in with them, and offer them what that required. She thought it was the most useful thing she had ever done, which was a thought that required a moment Claire's throat, of sitting with, because she had spent 26 years in a classroom, believing that was the useful thing, and she did not want to diminish her. But the school had been, she had begun to understand this clearly, a preparation for this. The skills were the same: attention, patience, the willingness to meet a person where they were, rather than where you thought they ought to be. Ruth had known probably, when she had left the shop, and the notebook, and the blue tin, and the slow-releasing woodruff, that her granddaughter was exactly the right person for this. She had simply trusted the inheritance, to know its timing. It had March came for the second time, and the narcissus came up again. She had expected them, had been watching for them. In fact, with a combination of anticipation and patience, she had been practicing all winter. But when they came, they were still a surprise, because that is the nature of things that are planted in faith. Even when you know they are coming, their arrival is a renewal. There were more this year. The bulbs had multiplied slightly over the winter, in the way of narcissus when they are well planted and left undisturbed, and the cluster by the back door was fuller, denser, with more flowers than last spring. She stood in the garden and looked at them, and felt again Ruth's deliberate intention in every one of them. She planted more that afternoon. New bulbs bought the market. Further along the bed, an extension, an addition to what had been given. This, she thought, was exactly the thing the card from 1849 had asked for. Not preservation, but continuation. The thing tended and added to and passed on. She made a cup of the garden after rain, to mark it, because that had been the first cup, and because some things earned their repetition. She sat in the garden in the early March sun, which was thin and cool, clear's throat, but present, and drank it slowly. The narcissus bent slightly in the breeze. The elm tree was beginning its first faint greening, barely visible, a decision more than an event. The stone walls held the garden in their old patient surround. She thought of nothing and everything in the particular way of gardens, and cups of tea, and early serve, spring mornings, when the year is beginning again, and the inheritance is intact. Ada came in one April morning with the quality of someone trying not to be obvious about something. She bought the plain Assam, which was what she bought when she wanted to establish normally before, saying whatever she had actually come to say, and she sat at the counter and drank it, and then said, "I've been offered the postmistress position in Harriet." Elena waited. It's more money and responsibility both. It would mean leaving Thornwig. Ada turned her cup slowly. "I've been here my whole life. Is that a reason to stay, or a reason to go?" Ada looked at her. "That's a Ruth thing to say. She left it for me in the notebook. It applies to most things." Ada considered this for a moment. "Both. I think it's both." She looked out the window at the village green, which was in its April best, the chestnut tree, in new leaf, pale green and luminous, the green itself, emerald. "I love it here. I'll always love it here. But I think I'd been waiting for something to want more than the safety of the known. And this might be it." Eleanor went to the shelves. She came back with Before You Go, the same jar she had made for Mirror 2 years ago now, in that early Saturday afternoon. That felt like the beginning of everything. Ada held a jar and looked at the label for a long moment. Then she looked at Elena. Her eyes were bright. "That's Mirror's," she said. "It's everyone's," Elena said. "When the time is right." Ada took the jar home that evening. She accepted the Harriet position the following week. Ada's replacement was a young man of 23, called Peter Marsh. No relation, though he had been considerably startled when he came in for the first time and saw the name above the door, who was quiet and slightly nervous, and wore his postal coat as if it might come off if he moved too quickly. He came in on his first week at the end of his morning round and stood at the counter and looked at salves, without asking for anything. Elena waited. After a while, he said, "My grandmother used to say there was a shop here that could tell what you needed." He looked slightly embarrassed to have said it. I didn't really believe her. "What did your grandmother need when she came?" He thought about it. "She used to come in December, I think. She said it helped with the dark, the short days." Elena went to the shelves and found the last light of October, the one she had been making for Thomas every autumn, and then reconsidered and reached for a different one, smaller, further back, which she had made herself the previous November and had not yet sold to anyone. December blue, she had called it, 'cause that was the color it worked with. The particular northern blue of winter afternoons, when the sun is already leaving. Do you have 3 more hours of dusk to get through? He held the cup with both hands, and drank it, and looked surprised. What's that? He said. Something I made, she said. For the dark. He came back the next week, and the week after. By his 3rd month in Thornwick, he was stopping in every morning before his round, the same slot Ada had always used, and he sat at the counter with his cup, and sometimes talked, and sometimes didn't. And either way it suited him, and the shop held him as it had held everyone who came without condition, without demand. Frances brought Ruth to the shop on a day in March that was her 1st birthday and set her on the counter. And the baby, who was not entirely a baby anymore, was a small, determined person with her mother's dark hair and an expression of careful inquiry toward the world. Looked immediately at the shelves of jars. She reached out one small hand toward the nearest jar. Elena moved it gently closer. The baby's fingers closed around the glass, and she held it very seriously and looked at it. She does that at home too, Frances said. Picks things up and holds them and really looks. Good instincts, Elena said. The jar she was holding as it happened was Everything Will Be All Right, the first jar Elena had ever touched in this shop. On the first evening, standing in the lamplight of the newly lit fire, she looked at the baby holding it. She thought about inheritance, about what is passed on and what is found, about the small rosewood box and the card from 1849 and the sweet woodruff planted in faith for someone who had not yet been born. She thought that some things were not planned but were nonetheless intended, that the world had in it, alongside all the uncertainty and all the difficulty, this quality, the willingness in certain places and certain practices and certain people to keep something ready for whoever arrived needing it. She made Frances a cup of something new, which was still, she thought, the right blend for Frances, who was always and happily becoming something she had not quite been before. She sat at the table with her daughter on her knee and drank it in the March morning, and the shop was warm and smelled of tea and dried herbs and the slight sweetness of birthday cake that Frances had brought wrapped in cloth. And outside the narcissus were blooming again on the evening of the 2nd anniversary of her arrival in Thornwick, the October evening that matched in weather and light and the quality of the village going about itself. That first evening when she had crossed the green with her 2 bags and the key in her hand and the thin, unopened envelope in her pocket, Elena closed the shop at 5 o'clock and stood for a moment in the quiet of it. She looked at the shelves, every jar in its place. The 51st blend on the 2nd shelf, slightly larger than the others, its label in her handwriting, the small shelf below the counter with its accumulation of kept things, the fire, which she had built for the first cold night of autumn, burning steadily. She put the kettle on. She made herself a cup of Everything Will Be All Right, not because she was in need of the assurance it offered, or not exactly, but because it was the jar she had first held in this room on the first evening, not knowing anything yet, holding the glass in the lamplight, with the fire just catching in the grate, and the whole unknown weight of this place in front of her, and because it seemed right on an anniversary to hold the beginning and the present in the same cup. She carried it to the window table and sat down outside the village green in the October dusk. The chestnut tree, which she loved now, with a particular love of things that have been present at important moments, losing the last of its leaves in the evening breeze. The gas lamp already lit. 2 people crossing the green, Mrs. Fowler's daughter, she thought, and the man from the farm at the end of the western lane, whose name she had learned in March, walking home in the early dark. Inside the lamp on the table, the fire, the shelves, she held the cup. The tea was warm and amber and tasted as it always had, of a certainty she could not prove from any position outside it, but that was present whenever she needed it, that the difficult things had a reason, that the ordinary days were not lesser than the extraordinary ones, but were often more important, that the smallest attentions accumulated into something that mattered, that what you planted in faith would come up in its season, and that it was possible in this life, in this world, in this particular narrow shop in a Yorkshire village, to be entirely and exactly where you were meant to be. She drank the cup slowly. The elm tree moved in the evening wind. Clears. The village lamp made its quiet star on the dark glass. Somewhere in the lane, a door opened and closed. She sat with her hands around the empty cup, warm still, for a long time. She was home. Thank you for listening. Rest well.